Professor Lauren Ross from the University of Irvine. Lauren has had a very particular parcours. She studied medicine on the one hand side in Irvine, but she also got a degree, a particular affinity towards philosophy. So she has her PhD in science and philosophy from the University of Pittsburgh. Also a master's in bioethics. And from this you see again the collision of the different streams that allow you to actually go beyond the normal. And in this case, one could call it mathematical philosophy. So she has received a prestigious Humboldt Fellowship. Together, I believe it's a mathematical philosophy department at Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich, isn't it? And other awards such as the NSF Career Award. Her focus is, in fact, in mathematical philosophy, particularly on a topic that is very close to our heart. Us as neuroscientists, we'd like to understand why and how the brain works. For this, we make causal hypotheses, and we try to formulate them mechanistically. So we are talking about formulation of formulation and formalization of causal hypothesis in terms of a particular language that is then linked to mechanisms, or if you come from a different domain, signaling pathways. Are there differences? To what degree is it the same? What is the explanatory power? I think this will be the direction of your presentation that you will share with us and share your thoughts with us on this topic. So it's my pleasure to invite you to the stage, Lauren, and speak to us. Professor Ross. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the lovely introduction, Victor, and thank you also for the invitation to be here today. It's a pleasure. A common goal in the field of neuroscience, and in the Human Brain Project in particular, is the goal of gaining and providing an in-depth understanding of the complex structure and function of the human brain. In neuroscience, and in the theory and philosophy of neuroscience, we often distinguish across different types of understanding. We have models that give us descriptive information about brain outcomes and neural outcomes. We have models that give us predictive information, and we have models that classify, that organize and order systems according to different goals that we have. However, when we're interested in providing some of the deepest types of understanding of the brain, we're often interested in a different type of model. We're often interested in models that are explanatory. And explanatory models don't just describe, predict, or classify brain and neural outcomes. They explain them. And they explain them, in most cases, by appealing to the causes in the causal structure that produce and that are responsible for these outcomes. The main idea here is that causes explain their effects, and that causes give us control over their effects. If you were to intervene on a cause, this gives you control over the effect of interest. This starts to reveal why explanatory causal models are so special and what sets them apart from these other types of models. And this is that they give us information about control. We care about this, of course, because we don't just want to describe, predict, and classify brain diseases and brain disorders. We want to control them. We want to change them for the better. So causal information and these causal explanatory models are essential here in giving us guidance for how we can develop and design treatments, preventions, and cures for brain diseases and brain disorders. In the context of these explanatory models, there's a very common causal term that frequently shows up. This is the term mechanisms. It's often suggested that if you want to get this explanatory power, you need to identify a particular type of causal information or causal structure. It's often referred to as mechanistic or as identifying the mechanisms that are underlying these brain outcomes, that govern these outcomes and behaviors, and that regulate them. What's interesting about this is it's not suggested that mechanisms are just one type of causal structure in the brain. Typically, it's assumed or suggested that this is the type of causal structure in the brain, that this captures some kind of fundamental knowledge that powers our explanations and understandings of brain and neural outcomes and behaviors, and that this captures the kind of basic causal information that we want and that we're interested in. This is interesting and puzzling in some sense because there are, of course, many other causal concepts that frequently show up in neuroscience. It appears as though these other causal concepts refer to systems and structures that have different features, and in many cases it looks like they're also giving us explanatory power. Examples here are concepts like pathways, circuits, constraints, and it's also the case that networks and topologies can have a causal interpretation. So there's a number of interesting questions that show up here because we have this kind of prioritization of mechanistic information, but these other types of causal concepts that come up. A first question that this raises is, are all causal explanations of the brain mechanistic? And if they are, what does this mean? What do we mean by mechanism here? A second question is, do other causal structures explain? If they do, how do they do this? What are their features, their uses, and their limitations? These are questions that are theoretical, they're philosophical, and they're extremely practical and important. Answers to these questions matter for the type of causal information that we prioritize in the field and that we value. They matter for the type of causal structure that grant agencies tell scientists to identify and that they're going to fund. And they matter for clarity about causal communication in the field, for how experts communicate to each other about causation in their work, and how they communicate their work to the public and to other audiences. So today what we'll do is we'll take a look at two main causal concepts that frequently show up in neuroscience, the concepts of mechanism and pathway, and we'll take a look at their features, their uses, and the role that they play in explanation. The first concept that we'll start with is the notion of mechanism. Examples of mechanisms in neuroscience include mechanisms of ion channel flow. We have signal propagation mechanisms, enzyme reaction mechanisms, and a drug's mechanism of action. The term mechanism, like most causal terms, is not always used precisely or consistently in the field. However, there are uses that are much more common than others, and there are uses that are much better than others. Paradigmatic mechanisms are causal structures that have at least three main features. A first feature of mechanisms is that they're hierarchical. This is sometimes also referred to as they're having a part-whole character. And the idea here is that mechanisms have lower-level causal parts. These parts all interact together, they work together to produce some higher-level outcome or behavior of the system. So if you're interested in explaining signal propagation, it's probably the case that the parts you're focused on are particular ions, ion channels, subtypes of ion channels, their density along the membrane, and how all of these factors, and probably many others, work together to produce signal propagation in a neuron. A second feature of mechanisms is that they're causal structures that involve significant amounts of fine-grained detail. A very simple monocausal model, where you have one cause and one effect, isn't enough to be a mechanism. It's too simple. A very sparse network model also doesn't count as a mechanism. One indication that mechanisms involve this type of fine-grained detail is that scientists are often very hesitant to say that they've ever identified the complete mechanism for an effect or outcome. They always there's often a view that they need more and more detail before they're satisfied with saying they have a complete mechanism. A third feature of mechanisms is that the causal relationships that they contain are described and have information about mechanical interactions. They have mechanical information. This often involves describing the causal relationship in terms of it having some type of force, action, or motion. So in a mechanism, it isn't enough to just say that X is a cause of Y. You need to say how it causes Y. You need to say that it bends, pushes, pulls, compresses, splices, binds. These are causal verbs that are often capturing this extra mechanical information. And this third feature of mechanisms is related to the second, in the sense that when you provide this additional information about how a cause produces its effect, you're giving more fine-grained detail about the system. Mechanisms are often analogized to a particular type of system. They're often analogized to machines. This is because standard machines that we're familiar with in everyday life often have these three main features. And mechanisms are associated with giving us information about how a system works. Once you open up this black box, you identify these causal parts, how they work together. You're giving information about how a neuron is functioning, how this signal is propagating along the neuron. So this is our first causal concept and causal structure. The second is pathways, the notion of a pathway. Examples of pathways in neuroscience are neural pathways. We have many examples of these. Single axonal projections, we have microcircuits, we have nerve tracts, higher scale causal connections in the brain. Other examples of pathways are metabolic pathways. We have developmental pathways like stem cell differentiation and cell signaling pathways, just to name a few. Pathways are a causal structure that have at least four main features. A first feature of pathways is that they involve a sequence of causal steps. They're not always linear. Of course, they can be branching or they can take on many other types of configurations. A second feature of pathways is that this sequence of steps is outlining a route along which you have the flow of some entity. And it's often information or material. So of course, with neural pathways, we're often interested in the flow of information, the flow of a signal, but in other cases, there's the study of material along the neuron, if we're interested in axonal transport or axonal trafficking. In other cases, like metabolic pathways, it's often material that's the focus, the flow of metabolites along a metabolic pathway. And in developmental pathways, again, it's often the flow of material, either particular cells, a tissue, or an organism as it's moving along the sequence of developmental steps. A third feature of pathways, and one that starts to really capture how they differ from mechanisms, is that they are extremely abstract. Pathways omit huge amounts of detail, and it's often causal detail. These are very sparse, often higher level causal structures. There's at least two main ways in which pathways abstract from detail. A first is that they often omit lower level mechanistic information about how you move from one step to the next. So in a very standard metabolic pathway, like the glycolytic pathway here, what we're being shown is that you're moving from one metabolite to the other, and we're often abstracting from information about that particular chemical conversion, about how an enzyme gets us from one step to the next. A second way in which pathways abstract from information and causal detail is that they represent very complex causal processes in an economy of causal steps. So in developmental pathways like stem cell differentiation here, what we see is movement from a particular cell type to another, and this is represented in a single step. You could, of course, divide this up into many steps, but that's not being done with many pathway representations. You abstract from that kind of detail. And we'll start to see soon why this feature of pathways allows them to give certain types of explanations. A fourth and final feature of pathways is that the causal connections and causal relationships they contain are described in terms of connections, mere causal connections. Unlike mechanisms, pathways aren't telling you how a cause is producing its effect. They are simply showing you that X and Y are causally connected. So pathways are giving us information about who is connected up to who in some space, not the fine-grained details about exactly how they're connected up. Pathways have their own analogy. Mechanisms are analogized to machines. Pathways are often analogized to roadways, highways, and city streets. Of course, this makes sense when you think of one of their main roles in emphasizing the flow of an entity along a route, in the same way that you have the flow of traffic or vehicles along a roadway. And when pathways are connected up together, they're often represented in what are referred to as maps or roadmaps of pathways in some domain. When you look at these maps, it can help make it much more clear exactly how pathways differ from mechanisms. So if you look at a particular pathway map, metabolic roadmaps, what you can tell is that the map isn't giving you information about individual parts that are all interacting together and grinding together like gears to produce a single outcome of the system. The map is a possibility space. It's giving you a sense of different routes that an entity can travel through in some space. The map tells you that if you start at any particular point, it shows you where you can go, where that entity can flow to. It also shows you where it can't flow to and where it can't move to. You can use a map to explain, in these cases, many different outcomes. Typically with a mechanism, they're relative to and defined by a particular explanatory target. Pathway maps are giving us information about where an entity is flowing in some domain. So part of what we're starting to see is how pathways and mechanisms are causal structures that have different types of features. The different features that they have allow them to provide different types of explanations. How do we see this? Recall that I suggested that mechanisms explain by giving us information about how a signal is propagated along a neuron. While mechanisms can explain how a signal is propagated along a neuron, what they often fail to explain is where exactly that signal will flow. This is something that your pathway is going to give you information about and going to explain, because it plays a constraining role with respect to where the particular lower level mechanisms that make up signal propagation flow. There's at least two main ways in which we start to see this. Pathways, in this case, are going to explain a particular location that the signal will flow to. And if you have different pathway connections, it will explain why, with excitation of a particular neuron, your signal will flow to many locations, many downstream locations, versus one. So one feature of pathway explanations involves a kind of constraining role. Another way to see this is that if you take either of these two microcircuits or a set of pathway connections, you can change the lower level mechanisms of the system, but they're still going to be guided by the same pathway. So if you want to identify what makes a difference to where the signal flows to, or if the signal is flowing to many locations versus one, what makes a difference to that are the pathway connections. And if you want control over that, if you want to change that, you should intervene on and change the pathway, not the lower level mechanisms. A second way in which pathways explain is by unifying different systems together. And in these cases, they can give us explanations that are far more general than many mechanistic explanations. A nice example of this comes from examples of metabolic and cell signaling pathways. In many of these cases, these pathways are evolutionarily conserved. And what this means is that you find the same pathway across many different organisms and many different cell types and tissues in our own body. A nice example of this is the glycolytic pathway, the process by which glucose is converted and broken down into pyruvate. The glycolytic pathway, glycolysis, is a evolutionarily conserved pathway. It's present in nearly all organisms on the entire planet and in all tissues of our body. So suppose you want to explain why is it, or how is it the case that all of these organisms on the planet and all of our tissues, how is it the case that they convert glucose into pyruvate? If you want to provide this explanation, you can cite and appeal to the sequence of causal factors along the pathway, because these are shared across all of these organisms and all of these tissues. You can't appeal to the lower level mechanisms that instantiate or that are underneath this causal pathway, because they differ wildly across all of these systems. If you look, for example, at the very first step of glycolysis, there's of course a particular enzyme that's performing this chemical conversion, converting glucose into glucose 6-phosphate. But if you look at the same first step of glycolysis across different organisms and different tissues, you find that that step is catalyzed by completely different enzymes. So if you try to include that lower level detail, once you do, you can no longer give a general explanation that applies to all of the systems, because they don't all share that lower level detail. If you want to identify the causal structure and the causes that are shared across all of those systems, the causes that you can intervene on to get control over this process in all systems, they're captured at the level of this higher level pathway, not at the level of the lower level, not at the scale of these lower level mechanisms. So this is giving us a kind of first overview of how pathways explain. They sometimes have this constraining feature, and in other cases, they give us explanations that unify, that bring together systems that differ in terms of their microstructural detail. Let me give two further examples that are a bit more concrete. A first example that I have here involves diseases that are causally heterogeneous. What does it mean to say that a disease is causally heterogeneous? In this context, what it refers to is when you have different patients with the exact same disease that acquire this disease as a result of completely different causal factors. When the causal factors are genetic, we refer to these cases as diseases that are genetically heterogeneous. An example of this is retinitis pigmentosa. There are over 100 causal genes that are causally relevant to this disease. So suppose you want to explain this disease in the human population. What explains retinitis pigmentosa in humans? Or suppose you want to explain why is it the case that different causes all produce the exact same disease phenotype, the exact same effect? Well, one way that you can do this is by appealing to the fact that these different causal factors are all interfering with the same causal pathway. What we have found is that these different genetic mutations, in many cases, are targeting different proteins that are all present in the same visual pathway. So if you want to identify the shared causal etiology of this disease, what all of these patients have in common, or at least many of them have in common, you should appeal to and should focus on the causal pathway that unifies these causal factors together. It's disruptions to this causal pathway that are present in all or most of the cases of this disease. And this doesn't just matter for giving a nice, fancy explanation with words. It matters for treatment. It matters for how you actually think about and consider treating this disease in the population. As researchers state in this space, it's necessary to develop treatments that are applicable to all causative mutations. If you want to identify a process that involves all of these causative mutations, you should focus on the causal pathway that unifies them together. For this reason and the others that are mentioned here, some of these diseases are referred to as pathway diseases. And to be clear, I'm not suggesting that mechanisms aren't important or that they don't give us important types of explanation and understanding. The suggestion is they give us different types of explanations. If you are going to focus on a particular genetic mutation or disruptions to a particular protein, of course that's important, and it's going to allow you to give a more detailed explanation of a particular subgroup of patients with this disease. But if you focus on just that genetic mutation and disruptions to that protein, you can fail to give explanations or fail to identify causal structures that are relevant to all of these cases. A second and final example here of pathway explanations comes from the context of lesion network mapping. This is an example that involves single lesion analyses and the human connectome. One thing that's been identified in a number of these cases is that lesions in completely different areas of the brain, in some cases, can produce the exact same symptom across different patients. And again, we have an interest in explaining why this is the case. Whenever we have a situation where different causes produce the same effect, we find this puzzling, we want an explanation, and of course, we want explanations for particular types of symptoms and symptomologies. One way that this is explained is, in this case, on the basis of the fact that if you focus on these lesions, they all causally converge on and operate through the same shared brain network that leads to this particular symptom. This is related to what is sometimes referred to as a final common pathway structure. This shows up in many different scientific contexts. And in these cases, we often have different causal factors that all converge on and operate through the same shared causal process that then leads to this outcome of interest. When you identify this type of structure, you can give an explanation for what unifies these causes together. They all funnel through the same area of convergence. You can also explain why they're all producing the exact same symptom. Another thing that's helpful about having an understanding of causal connections that fits this final common pathway structure is you can see what different types of control you get when you focus on different features of the causal system. If you focus on that point of convergence, you can get control over all instances of the effect. If you focus on an upstream cause, you'll only get control over a subset of all of the patients with this symptom. Part of what we're seeing and part of what I've suggested in this analysis is that pathways and mechanisms are different types of causal structures. They're different in the sense that they have distinct features. The features allow them to give us different types of explanations. Pathway explanations are often much more general. They're explanations that we find useful when we want to explain distinct instances of some outcome across patients where there's lots of variation at lower scales. Mechanisms are often advantageous when we want a more local explanation. Once you start to include lots of lower level detail, you're often more confined in what that detail is relevant to, what it gives you control over, and what it makes a difference to. This also helps reveal some of the limits of causal mechanisms. A first limit that we see in these cases is that the relevant causal information isn't always at lower scales. In some cases, there's a higher scale causal structure that makes a difference to the explanatory target and that gives us control over that target. We also see that more details don't always improve an explanation. In some cases, when you start to include lower level details, if they're not present in all systems of interest, you can no longer provide an explanation that applies to all of those systems. One way that I sometimes refer to aspects of both of these features is that causal explanation is not a game of how low can you go, but instead a game of what gives you control. And sometimes the causal structure that gives you control over your explanatory target, it's at a higher scale, right? Another reason for why we should be skeptical of all explanations being mechanistic is their causes are at lower levels, explaining a higher level effect. It's difficult to think of how this model could capture various types of environmental and social causes that appear to be at higher scales and perhaps influencing systems at lower scales. Of course, this entirely depends on how we define mechanism. Part of what I'm suggesting in this talk is that the way we define mechanism is important, and it needs to be very clear. The definition and analysis that I've given are providing us with a more narrow conception of mechanism. In some cases in the scientific literature, the term is used very broadly, almost in the sense that it could refer to any type of causal system of interest. There's a number of disadvantages with using mechanism in this broad way. A first disadvantage is that you lose out on the ability to make those analogies. Causal pathways in neuroscience and many other scientific fields, they're not called pathways for fun. They're called pathways because they're being analogized to other systems like roadways, highways, and city streets that have similar features. We see the same thing with the cascade concept, the fact that it involves amplification, similar to a waterfall. Another disadvantage of using the mechanism concept broadly is you still have to tell us what you mean by mechanism. So if mechanism refers to any type of causal system, well, you have to let us know what the particular features are of the mechanism that you're referring to or that you're interested in. And finally, if mechanism is used to refer to just any type of causal system, it loses its meaning. You might as well just use the term causal system or causal structure. This is disadvantageous because we do think mechanism has a meaning. It often has a reductive character. It often suggests you have some kind of significant fine-grained detail, right? And so if you want to capture, if mechanism is going to have meaning and be meaningful, well, we need to be very clear about what types of causal systems it refers to. In conclusion, if in-depth understanding of the brain is provided by identifying causal structure, well, it's important to be clear on the types of causal structure that provide this. We need to be clear on what these structures are, what their features are, their limitations, and the role that they play in explanation. This raises a number of important questions for the field. Questions such as, what are the types of understanding that we prioritize and privilege? What are the standards that legitimate and genuine explanations need to meet? What are the goals that we have in the field? And are the methods, principles, and strategies that we're using serving those particular goals? Providing answers to these questions matters because it matters for clear communication, it matters for supporting and encouraging interdisciplinary work, and it matters because it can provide us with guidance as the field continues to move forward in advancing how we understand and how we explain the brain. Thank you.